Hi, welcome to a video about the P5 sound library. This one is about the p5.PolySynth class. So what do I mean by the p5.PolySynth class? It's another of the classes that the p5 sound library makes available to us. And this one is literally kind of what it sounds like. It's a synthesizer, which is pretty exciting because synthesizers are way back in fashion for the last little while. And the polysynth class allows us to basically create and play with a synthesizer in our code. So it's indisputably, that word, cool. It's a cool thing. So let's play around with it. Let's look at the documentation and let's try to understand the P5 polysynth. So first things first, we ought to go over to the main P5 sound library reference, the API documentation, which is here. And we want to find the polysynth, which is just here. So there's also something called monosynth. We're going to ignore monosynth. It's kind of the basis of how the polysynth works, but generally speaking, we're going to want to play our notes with the polysynth for reasons that we may or may not talk about. It's not super important. And it's got a very blunt description, play musical notes. This one's actually fairly, I guess, straightforward conceptually. It's just like having a keyboard where you can play a note. So I don't want to get too deep into it. I just want to look at the basics of what we can do. So let's open up polysynth. And let's look at the example. Let's just click it and see what it does. Ooh, yeah. So it played several notes there. It was actually playing a chord, right, rather than a single note. It sounded quite lovely. And that's the kind of sound that we're going to be looking at generating with a polysynth. And if we go and actually just take a quick look at where the stuff takes place, where's the kind of the good stuff? The good stuff is here. Here is where we can see kind of what it's doing, right? So again, we're sort of beginning by looking at the example. That's just what we tend to do. You can see there's three successive calls to the polysynth play method. So there's a play method. Makes sense. We're playing the synth. And you can see we're giving it a piece of information where the first thing is clearly a note, right? G2, well, maybe not clearly, it depends on how familiar you are with music. G2 represents a specific G note on a keyboard, if you like. This one's 2 below middle C. I believe G4 is the sort of the middle G on a standard keyboard. C3 is a C note, and G3 is also a C note. It's one octave. It's a G note, sorry, one octave higher than G2. There's some other stuff here as well. There's something called vel, which is velocity, which is the volume. I'm just literally reading up here. There's also apparently a delay, a time delay, and then there's a duration, how long the note should be played for. So we can actually glean almost everything that we need to know about the library, about this class polysynth, literally just from here. However, it's worth reading on. So it sounds good. We're excited to be able to use it. It's good. It really sets the mood. So what is the description? An audio voice, already we don't know what the hell they're talking about, is used as a single voice for sound synthesis. Okay. The polysynth class holds an array of audio voice and deals with voice allocations with setting notes to be played and parameters to be set. Not the clearest piece of description I have ever seen in my life. What they mean by a voice is just, if you have a multi-voice synthesizer, it just means that it can play more than one note at the same time. A single voice synthesizer, so there's the monosynth class that we saw briefly on the main documentation page there. It can only play one note at a time because it only has one voice. That's all that it means. And what a voice is really basically an oscillator. That's how computers play sounds. So the polysynth is able to play multiple notes at the same time. That's the point of it, basically. I wish their description was a little more helpful, but it isn't. The syntax, if we're going to create a polysynth, we create a new p5.PolySynth object and we tell it what synth voice, not the most helpful parameter name, but I shouldn't really be critiquing. It's a number and it's telling us which kind of voice to use. Its defaults to p5 monosynth. That's fine. We'll leave that alone. And max voices. How many voices do you want your polysynth to be able to play? The default is 8. Again, that seems fine. Both of these are optional, right, because they have defaults, so we'll probably just ignore those parameters in this particular case, just because we can't be bothered. So continuing on, there's a section called fields. Field basically is the same thing as properties of a class, right? So they're the kind of specific, like the kind of the variables that the class has inside it. And you can see there's a few things here. Again, because I don't want to get too kind of in the weeds, I'm just going to ignore the fields. Because what I really care about is just the play method, which we've already, oh goodness me, that we've already kind of seen. But that's really where I want to direct my attention. I'll just point out that there are other things here, right? There's this thing that's a note ADSR. ADSR is this language that is used in digital music production. It's a way of specifying an envelope for a sound. The envelope refers to kind of how the sound changes, usually in volume over time. ADSR stands for attack, delay, sustain, and release, and there are different volume settings that a sound goes through as it plays. So attack is right at the beginning, delay is as it decreases in volume towards its sustained volume. Sustain is the amount of time it stays at a sustained volume, and then release is the amount of time that it takes to release away to no volume at all. It's not that important. If you really want to get into digital music stuff, I mean, it's super important, but you don't have to know about that in order to play around with a polysynth. So I'm going to kind of leave it out. So let's focus all of our attention on just playing notes, because that will be simple and fun. So let's look at the documentation for the play method. What's the example? It's the same chord playing thing, because it was a good example of that, so they used it twice. Fair enough too. It's a great and beautiful sound that they have generated. So let's do an even simpler version of this though. So we'll take their example on board. We can see that this is kind of where the action is. That's fine. Let's quickly read this description. So play a note by triggering note attack and note release with sustain time. So again, you kind of need to know some of that lingo, that attack is the start of a sound and release is the end of a sound, and sustain is the amount of time that it kind of maintains volume while it's playing. So there's language stuff going on here that's that you maybe need to know a little bit about. But let's persevere. So the syntax is play, and you can see everything's optional, which is pretty funny. So there's a note to play, and it says this is a number, but it doesn't actually have to be a number, because we literally saw in the example up here it can be a string, right? G2, C3, G3. Those are notes specified in terms of a keyboard, which is often a little bit easier to think about than the actual hertz of the frequency of a note. For example, like an A note, I think an A4 note is 440 hertz. I think it is. It's one of the A's. So the note can either be a number in terms of frequency, or no, I see it's not. My apologies. This is a note, it's a MIDI note. So MIDI is yet another specification for notes. Let's ignore their MIDI thing unless you want to get into it yourself at some point, and focus on the note is going to be specified as this kind of keyboard style note here. I apologize for getting a bit excited there. The velocity, that's how kind of hard you hit the key. So it's 0, I guess, is like you literally don't hit the key, which might be a little pointless. Or 1 is like hitting the key as hard as you can. So that's sort of how hard you attack the key. There's also a seconds from now parameter here. That's how long to delay before you actually make the sound audible. So it's a delay. And there's a sustain, which is how long to actually play the note for, and triggering the release. So it's the sustain time. And I guess that's in seconds. They don't actually seem to be specifying, which is a shame. So that's what we need to do. So let's just use it. Enough talking, Pippin. Let's actually use this thing. So we can see that we say basically the synthesizer dot play, the note, the velocity, the seconds to delay it, and the amount of time to sustain it for. So let's actually just do this. Let's go back over here. So we've got a basic setup. I'm including user start audio in setup because we're working with sound. So we're going to need to create one of these synthesizers. So I'm going to call it synth because I'm a cool guy. And again, it's better probably to create the synthesizer in setup once p5 is fully loaded. So synth is assigned new p5.PolySynth because that's the kind of synthesizer that we're using. And I'm not going to specify anything in here, right? You can specify to use the monosynth, and you can specify the number of voices, but I'm happy with the defaults in this case. So let's just leave them alone. Then to actually trigger my synthesizer, let's have a mouse pressed, just because it's a classic interaction. And how do I do it, right? So this is where I need to use that play method. So I have to say synth, because that is my synthesizer object, dot play, and then I have to specify the note. So C4 is, I believe, middle C. It's a classic and boring note for me to play. How hard do I want to hit that key? I'm going to hit it as hard as I possibly can with 1. I don't want to delay it. I'm remembering that the second, so there was the note, then the velocity, then how long to delay playing. I don't see any reason to delay at all, so I'm going to say 0. And then the final thing was what? Sustain. How long should the note stay active? I'm assuming this is in seconds, so let's say 1 second. So play a C4 every time I click at full velocity or volume with no delay and sustain it for 1 second. Let's go listen to that and make sure it does something. Here we are, and if I click, you can hear how that's just an oscillator, right? You can hear it fades out a little bit on the release there, and that's just middle C. And we can change this, right? So if we played C2, that's 2 octaves lower. Beautiful. And it's a little bit easier, as you can see, to kind of think about this musically because we're using musical notation. So if you've ever played an instrument or looked at sheet music or anything like that, maybe this is a little more intuitive. We can play D3. We can add a flat, D flat 3. I assume we can maybe do D sharp as well. There you go. So we've got the ability to play musical notation. Beautiful. So that's what it does. I could leave you there, but maybe that would be a little bit boring of me to do. So let's make a couple of examples of what we could do with this. The key thing that occurs to me is that it's nice if we can play more than one kind of note. And if we're going to be able to play different notes, we need some way to specify what the notes are. So let's start off by allowing the user to feel like a fake pianist. So they're going to hit keys, and they're going to end up playing random notes each time they hit the key, but the cumulative effect will be that they sound like they're playing the piano, even though they're not. And a way to do that is to specify a set of notes that kind of are related to each other, and the one way that we can have a set of notes related to each other is to have a specific scale. So let's have a scale, and because we've got a scale as a group of notes, right, it's a specific sequence of notes, it makes sense to store them inside of an array. So we're going to create a notes array, right? And in here, inside our array, we're going to list the notes in a scale. And I'm going to choose F minor because I have it handy. You can look up different scales online. So F minor starts with an F. I'm going to specify F4. So we're starting kind of in the middle of the keyboard. So F4, then G4. So that's a G note, obviously. Then A flat 4, and then B flat 4, and then C4, good old middle C, and then what? D flat 4. That B is used to symbolize flat. Then E flat 4, and then all the way back up to F again. So F5 is the next F. That's also a function key for doing saving and stuff, but that's a completely separate thing that I should not have said. So that is our F minor scale, F minor. These are the notes in F minor. So what do I want to do? Well, each time, and really it doesn't make sense to click the mouse. It's not going to be a very satisfying pianist who plays by clicking a mouse. So we'll use key pressed, right? Because the keyboard is more like a piano than the mouse is. We still want to play a note, right? But we don't want to just always play D sharp 3 because that will make us sound like a not very good pianist. That'll make me sound like this. Super unimaginative. We don't like that pianist. He's lame. He's me. So what do we want to do? We want to play a random note from this array, and we've seen how to do this kind of thing before. And indeed, it's super easy with p5 because the random function can just literally do this for us. So I can create a random note variable, and I can assign it the random function, and I just pass the random function the array. So I'm saying, give me a random thing from the notes array, and that's going to be a random note. And I can tell the synth to play that note, random note. I don't know that I want to sustain for quite so long. I don't think I want to sustain for a whole second. So let's sustain for like a quarter of a second. Yeah, and that's it, right? So every time I press a key, give me a random note and play that note. Let's see what that sounds like. That high F sounds really ugly. So if look, I'm going to do it. I'm going to move down an octave because I really didn't enjoy that high F. C3, D flat 3, E flat 3, and F4. Let's try that. I sound like a professional pianist. That's what they sound like when they play at lounge bars. I don't know if you knew that. It sounds much more like I knew what I was doing playing around on a keyboard than I had any right to, right? Because the random notes are coming from a specific scale. So they have a bearer relationship to each other musically, and we can take advantage of that even though we're actually playing them completely randomly. So that's an obvious thing that we might want to do, is just play notes randomly when the user presses keys. But what if we wanted a ghostly pianist in a ghost lounge bar that plays the keyboard automatically? Well, to do that, instead of doing stuff in key pressed, we might want to call some kind of a function that would play these notes every number of seconds. So let's create a play random note function and put those two lines in there. So now whenever I call play random note, it's going to play a random note. And when I press a key, what I want to do is start a ghost pianist playing. So when I press a key, I'm going to say set interval. So we haven't necessarily talked about this function, but let's meet it now since it's a goodie. Set interval is going to allow me to call a function every number of milliseconds. So what do I want to do? I want to call the random note function over and over again every what? Every 500 milliseconds. So what is set interval going to do here? I call set interval when I press a key. I only want to call it once, really. So I'm going to only press the key once to sort of start my ghost player. So it's like start the ghost player. And every 500 milliseconds, it's going to call the play random note function, which is just down here. And that's going to play a random note. And then it's going to wait for 500 milliseconds, and then it's going to call it again. Then it's going to wait, then it's going to call it again. And that's what set interval does. It's a pretty useful function for exactly this kind of situation. One really important note that I don't write play random note with the parentheses after it. I tell it the name of the function to call. I don't actually do the parentheses because that would call the function. So what does this sound like? It's exactly the same thing as when I was pressing the keys myself. It's just now I won't have to do the work. So what does it sound like? I started off by pressing a key. It's very rhythmic, obviously, because it's playing every 500 milliseconds. I mean, it's not the best pianist, but it's not the worst pianist. Okay, I'm just reloading to stop it. I could make it play faster. Maybe I could make it the sustain like smaller, and I could make it play every 200 milliseconds. Let's see what that sounds like. Oh yeah. So I mean, even a small change like that is pretty satisfying. Like it's cool to play. It's just cool to play around with these things. If you're interested in how you would stop this interval, you check out the notes for this video, and I've got information about that as well. I just wanted to kind of move through this reasonably swiftly to show you the idea rather than getting caught up in implementation details. So that sounds cool. It's like a cool jazzy ghost pianist who loves to play only in F minor explicitly. But how did that pianist learn to be so good? They learned by playing scales. So the other thing that we might definitely want to do once we've got an array of notes, and this happens to be an array of a scale, right, in order, is we might want to play the notes in sequence rather than playing them randomly. So how do we access things in an array in sequence? Well, we need a variable to track which one we're playing currently. So we should have a variable called something like current note, and we should start it at the first position in the array, which is 0. So it's going to be F3 initially, right? And as we play keys, we should increase the current note so that we play first F3, then we make current note 1, so it plays G3, then we make it 2, so it plays A flat 3, and it kind of cycles through the array to the end. And then I think it would make sense to go back to the beginning since we're playing a scale, and that would be sort of perfectly irritating. So what is that? What do we need to do to change that? Well, we don't want to play a random note anymore. We want to play the next note. So we want to play the note that is in the notes array at position current note. So the first time that's 0, so that's going to be the notes array at position 0, which is F3. And then if we increase current note by saying current note is current note plus 1, Then the next time that we play a random note, current note is going to be 1, and it's going to play G3. Then the next time it's going to be 2, and it's going to play A flat 3, B flat 3, C3, etc. You can see that there could be a problem because after it plays F4, it's going to go off the end of the array, and that's never a good thing to do in programming. I was taught to fear it as if the sky was falling. It's not that serious, but it's not a good thing. So we also want to say if the current note is equal to the length of the array, i.e. It's gotten too far, because if it's at the length of the array, then that actually means it's off the edge here, right? Because this one is at position length -1. So once we're at the length, then we've gone too far. We can set it back to 0 so that it goes back to the beginning, just like a scale. Technically a scale you would go up and then back down, but to do that would be ever so slightly more complicated, so I'm not gonna do that right now. So that would give us our ghost scales playing player, right? Starts at current node 0 at F3 and goes up through the scale, and then when it reaches the end, starts the scale at the bottom again. And each time it plays a random note, it just accesses the current note. Oh goodness, I almost made a mistake there, right? My variable is called note, which is the next note to play. So I need to make sure that I play that note in my synth, or I'm going to get an error there. Good thing that I caught that while I was re-explaining for the third or fourth time. Each time we play, we're going to make the current note go up by 1 and then loop back to the beginning if we reach the end. So what does that sound like? Oh, that sounds too jazzy, if you ask me. There's something about that I think sounds a little overly jazzy. That makes me think that maybe something is going wrong in the way that I've written that. It's a happy accident because I think it does sound cool. I'm gonna slow it down a little bit as well, just because I think it's going a bit fast. You can hear clearly that there's something going wrong there, right? Because it's F3 is sounding like it's higher than A flat 3. I think. If you think about it, that's probably because these things are numbered from C or something. So I don't actually have a proper scale, is my guess. Is my guess as to what's going wrong here. So maybe if I went F2, G2, and then when it gets to A, we go up to 3, and then when we get all the way back up to F, that should be 3 as well. Let's see if that sounds any better. Happen, right? Let me just, because we start that interval every time we press a key, I can start it once, but I can also start it again. That sounds cool, but it's not what I was wanting to do, right? So there again, in the actual notes for the video, there's a way to make this not happen, which would be sensible for production code. So you can see I got the scale wrong initially there, but now when you listen to it, I think we could hear that it is the actual proper scale, which is good. They could be a real virtuoso. Sorry, I'm getting obsessed with this, but what if they played notes every kind of 150th of a second? Anyway, it's too fun. You can also obviously imagine that if you just put notes in here representing an actual melody instead of a scale, it would play that melody. I don't want to do that because I don't know how to do that. But let's just copy a few notes around and see what happens because I've come too far now. Let's do that. Let's see what that sounds like. Yeah, something for an action show. Again, just needs the drums. Yeah, okay. I almost started trying to beatbox, and I don't think anybody needs to hear that, but I was excited. So those are some things that we can do with a synthesizer, right? The PolySynth. It is another powerful idea, and also a nice simple idea, right? Like in the end, all that you're really ever doing is choosing a moment to play a specific note with the synthesizer, but it brings music. It literally brings music to your program, and it brings generative music. So it is a really exciting thing that we can do with programming. I hope that you share my enthusiasm. Hopefully I didn't get too excited and embarrass everybody. I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.